Today on Stronger Than Reason, we push and struggle with Killing Joke's 1985 album, Nighttime. Welcome to Stronger Than Reason. So some bands are great for the influence they have on other bands rather than for the success they themselves enjoyed. And industrial music of the 80s and 90s had a lot of these. In fact, the whole genre seems to have been built as a pyramid with the bands on the bottom supporting those on the top. And when you think of commercial crossover, Nine Inch Nails immediately comes to mind. After all, they broke through in the mainstream in a huge way, first with their debut Pretty Hate Machine, which I talked about in episode 8, and then with their follow-up, The Downward Spiral, which I just talked about a couple episodes ago. But really, industrial was always edging into the mainstream throughout this period. It was a long, continuous process of rising from the depths of the ocean, say in the Mariana Trench, with each band slowly rising part of the way and handing the baton to the next, if I can hopelessly mix my metaphors. For some bands, breakthroughs happened even during the course of their own careers, where suddenly they'd find themselves with a wider audience and worldwide exposure on MTV, so they were themselves conscious of that incremental rise. And I'm going to talk about one of those bands today. I can't say they ever broke through in the US in a big way, despite arguably predicting the sounds of the 90s and the 80s, ironically with a song called 80s too, as we'll see. This is a band cited as an influence by Al Jourgensen. Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin was a big fan, and he said that this band offered an antidote to the anodyne and unthreatening sounds of 80s synth pop, and also were just fantastic live, and he enjoyed seeing them. So this is a band that started their career with a tribal kind of energy, and by this, their fifth album, which they released in 1985, had transmuted it into a compelling amalgam of hard rock, dance, and electronics. In other words, it foreshadowed much of the industrial rock revolution of the coming years, and may have given Al a template to follow with The Land of Rape and Honey, which would come out in 86. The band, of course, is England's own Killing Joke, and the album is their breakthrough hit, Nighttime. This is the album that brought them mainstream acclaim, and let me talk a little about first hearing Killing Joke. It's a little weird for me to talk about this because I'm thinking hard about it, but I don't think any of my friends or I had any of their music back in the day. I didn't even have any dubbed cassettes of their stuff, which is really saying something because in 1990, if anyone had it, we all had it because dubbing tapes was pretty much our version of BitTorrent. So when did I first hear them? It definitely wasn't in 1985 when Nighttime came out. At that point, I was still pretty much listening only to Rush, and it's funny to think that Nighttime came out alongside Power Windows. But yeah, I had no inkling of alternative in 1985. I was still in the middle school, so, for me, it would really be a few years before I got into that kind of music. I think I first heard of Killing Joke in the music press, probably around 89 or 90 or so, when we were reading interviews and music stuff in Thrasher magazine. And I remember in one of these, Al was talking about his love for Killing Joke. And I do remember leafing through the K section in the record stores after reading that, kind of curious about them. So I did get passingly familiar with their albums, at least to recognize them. But I first heard them one night on 120 Minutes. It was a song from this album, and it was a real banger. It was called 80s. The video was really great. I mean, the band were there looking cool and playing their instruments, of course, and the lead singer was just something else. He was this really intense dude with dark hair and big eyebrows, and he was playing the part of this politician standing at a lectern with the US and Soviet flags on it, just gesticulating and ranting at the screen. And I don't know, I thought he was a great frontman. He was part singer and, part character actor. But what really got me was his voice. It was really raspy and deep, and it reminded me a lot of Douglas McCarthy from Nights Are Ebb, which is strange because Douglas has a very unusual voice. And here was a guy who was in the same ballpark, at least. able to get that barking kind of scream thing going on. But the song itself was really cool. It was catchy. It was also very aggressive. The guitarist, the bassist, and the drummer were 100% locked in, like a proper power trio. And when I picked up this CD and took it home for a deep listen, I was especially blown away. The bass on 80s is just amazingly funky, especially on the chorus, and the rhythm section is so on point, switching from regular time to double time and back again. But the whole song kind of revolves around this guitar lick. And what a lick it is. The guitar player just sounds like 3 people. It's really epic. So I learned right away that these weren't just some pretty boys, they were actually players, and I was intrigued. And later MTV would play some more of their songs. There's also a proper video for Love Like Blood, which was the other crossover tune from this album. It's much more of a synth rock track. And later they would play the video for Money Is Not Our God from their 1990 album Extremities, Dirt, and Various Repressed Emotions. And the video for that one struck me because it featured Martin Atkins on drums, who was immediately recognizable in his striped shirt. Martin is nothing if not a marketing genius. Of course, we learned all about Martin from the Live Ministry video. In case you didn't feel like showing up, the only difference here was that his hair was now black, not bleached blonde. But this album, Nighttime, would be my entree into the world of Killing Joke, and it was a really good first look. I could see how they fit into the evolution of alternative music from the 80s to the 90s. They were kind of like a missing link, an ancestor to the later industrial bands that I'd really get into, like Nine Inch Nails, Ministry, Revco, etc. So who were Killing Joke? I don't think I learned about the band history such as it was until the mid to late 90s, or maybe even the 2000s when Wikipedia became a thing. But they formed in 1979 during the post-punk boom in Cheltenham, England. They released their first self-titled album in October 1980, which interestingly was engineered by Phil Harding, who'd soon enough mix early tracks by Nights or Ebb. So the original lineup of this band was Jeremy Jazz Coleman on vocals and keyboard, Big Paul Ferguson on drums, Kevin Geordie Walker on guitar, and Martin Youth Glover on bass. And right away, you got to admire that they all have nicknames. Jazz and Paul founded the band and quickly added Geordie and Youth. In addition to forming a band, they also formed a record label called Malicious Damage. And they released a few albums. They got some notability. They also got some notoriety, which, there's a difference there. The notoriety was mostly for their controversial artwork, which, in retrospect doesn't seem so controversial all these years later, like a paste up of Fred Astaire dancing on a war field, for instance. It's not quite the cover to The Land of Rape and Honey or the Broken video, but, I guess it was a start. Soon enough, Jazz started dabbling in the occult, as you do, and I don't know why that is. He's clearly an intelligent guy, and, some intelligent people just seem susceptible to superstitious thinking, and maybe we all are to some extent. I'm not saying I'm totally above it, whether you're a bit OCD and insist that things are somehow better if you do them in a certain pattern, or whether you're following centuries-old religious customs, or whether you're just trusting human nature. The human mind has evolved to find meaning in patterns, and sometimes these things are real and sometimes they're not. But regardless, Jazz fell down a rabbit hole at one point and repaired to Iceland to await the imminent apocalypse. And this was not unlike George Harrison and John Lennon yanking the Beatles to Rishikesh to study transcendental meditation with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. But without any of the press or Beach Boys or photogenic starlets. So why did Jazz do this? I don't know, maybe this is another aspect of lead singer syndrome, which gives them delusions of grandeur. I really can't say. I know very little about Jazz personally other than what Chris Connolly wrote about him in his memoir. So, I also know he's the only guy in the band who regularly wears face paint and dresses in a boiler suit. So there's certainly something theatrical about him. And, I've hung out with my share of theater kids over the years. In fact, I'm pretty sure I am still a lifetime member of the International Thespian Society, ever since 10th grade theater club when we put on that production of The Miracle Worker. And to date, that's still been my only dramatic role, being the voiceover of a doctor in one of Anne Sullivan's memories. All I recall from that is huddling backstage with a mic and reading lines off the script, and of course the audience bursting out into spontaneous tears and applause or something. Yeah, I don't know, I might have forgotten that bit. Anyway, Jazz is clearly a man directed by whims, and his whim at the time was to hightail it to Iceland. I don't know, but if I were trying to hide from the apocalypse, I wouldn't want to go to an island known for its volcanoes. Maybe it's just me. But much like with the Beatles, the band first followed him there, but at that point, Youth decided he had better things to do, like go on to a successful music production career that would include starting a band with the real Paul McCartney, among a lot of other cool stuff. So yeah, he split. Paul Ferguson left with Youth for a while and then did eventually circle back to the band. So at this point, if you're keeping score, they were short one bass player. Enter Mr. Paul Raven. Now you might think, geez, could this guy have a more obviously fake stage name? And the answer is, of course he could. For instance, he could have called himself Dick Mansberger, or Dutch McApple, or Hieronymus Beef. But in fact, Paul Raven was his given name. It just happened to be super cool. And Wikipedia, which as we know is the next best thing to learning something, tells me that Paul's father and uncle were both famous musicians and authors in their own right. His dad, John, and Uncle Michael were folk musicians who also wrote a bunch of books about the history of England's Black Country. So Paul came from a talented and creative family. Now, nothing against Youth here, but honestly, Youth's bass playing never much stood out to me. Paul, on the other hand, I noticed right away, as I mentioned. I think he might be the funkiest bassist I've ever heard who plays with a pick. He's really damn good, and maybe it's the pick that makes him stand out against Geordie's guitar, that extra treble on the attack. Not sure, but this was the first time that the lineup would change, but it certainly wasn't the last. Over time, the drummer and bassist roles would swap in and out. Only Jazz and Geordie would remain constant in the band. So with this lineup, they recorded 3 albums. Of these, Nighttime was the second, and the 5th album overall. And I want to talk a bit about Geordie here, though, because I find him a little unusual as a guitarist. For one thing, he almost always played the same guitar. Not the same type of guitar. He almost always played the same guitar, a gold-top Gibson ES-295 hollow body, like the kind Scotty Moore played with Elvis Presley's band, which is, an unlikely choice for a heavy rock guitarist. Maybe, but it did give him a very distinctive sound. It's somewhat chiming and phased, and it just kind of cuts right through the mix and fills up all the mids really nicely. That's why he just sounds so huge on record. I think he kind of strung the damn thing with piano wire or something. He used really heavy strings and tuned it down to a D. Now, I had a hollow body guitar at one point in time and played it out a bit, and one thing that was immediately apparent was that it had a tendency to feed back a lot. So I had fun with that. Playing it live was kind of like surfing, because I'd back up toward my amp and the thing would just start taking off, and if you found the right spot to stand and the right way to hold it, you could ride that wave. It was just like endless sustain coming from this instrument, and it was an amazing and powerful sound beyond just playing the guitar normally. It was kind of like like a beast you could either enrage or tame just by moving around your amp. And I don't think Geordie was necessarily taking advantage of his hollow body in that way, at least not on the record. Maybe he did live, I don't know. But it is a fun aspect of hollow bodies, and it's one thing I kind of do miss now that I sold that thing. But I love Geordie's playing because he's very much a riff player. He tends to play repeated figures. He's not just strumming chords or playing leads. And most of the songs are based off of his riff ideas, to the point where I can imagine him just coming up with 10 riffs and the band saying, great, that's the album then. We're just going to play around that. So he was really central to their sound and their songwriting. And that idea of playing repeated figures meshed very well with the band's overall leaning toward tribal rhythms, especially in their early days. And that, I know that was kind of like a phase that a lot of early 80s bands went through, playing a lot of tribal type stuff. Songs were more based on a rhythm than anything else. So War Dance from Killing Joke's first album is a great example of that. It's just like 100% rhythm there. But, it's probably deceptively hard to play because the band has to be totally in step and locked in to pull it off. Anyway, I just wanted to call Geordie out because I love his playing and I think of him as the heart of Killing Joke. Now, the elephant in the foyer here is that Raven and Geordie are no longer with us. Unfortunately, Raven died in 2007 at just 46. And it's very strange for me to think I've outlived him. But really, experience-wise, he probably lived the equivalent of 2 or 3 of my lifetimes. So yeah, as I mentioned a few episodes back, Geordie died last November at 64, which is still pretty young these days. But, it really hit me. I like to think that all these guys are, eternal, that these bands are eternal, but they're really not. Bands are dynamic, as we talked about in the Pigface episode. They are concepts that have a beginning, they constantly evolve, and then they have an inevitable end. And speaking of Pigface, Raven was an early member, stepping in on bass to replace Paul Barker after their first album, Gub. Another thing I think about here is that Geordie famously smoked a lot, and I wonder to what extent that affected his health. I mean, these guys and rock and rollers in general tend to not take good care of themselves, which is fine and good when you're young and invincible, but tends to take its toll later in life. And I'm not trying to moralize here. I'm just saying that there is an eventual price to pay for living large. And I'm not saying it's a terrible thing. For some people, it's worth it. It's part of living the life they want to live. Like Frank Zappa said, to him, cigarettes were food and he didn't want to live without them. So fair enough. I just, happen to disagree. And for me, it's more about, being healthy in the long run and being able to do all the things you want to do in a long and healthy life. But I get that people disagree. I'm just curious about that. Anyway, Raven was an awesome bassist, but he clearly wasn't central to the band in the long run because soon after he passed, Youth came back into the fold and the original lineup reunited to make some truly amazing albums that, in my opinion, even surpass this early material, and they're ones I'd like to talk about someday. Those later albums were maybe Killing Joke at its critical peak, if not its commercial peak. So that's The Who, by and large, although I skipped over the fact that Martin Atkins from Pigface would sit in for an album one time when Paul Ferguson left, and this was just after the Ministry Mind tour while Pigface was revving up. And of course, they did have one other drummer over the years, some guy named Dave Grohl. I think Dave got involved as a goodwill gesture since Nirvana famously copped Geordie's 80s riff and turned it into the bass line of Nirvana's 92 hit Come As You Are. The band originally reached out to Dave to play some drums on a couple of songs in their self-titled 2003 album. Reportedly, Dave listened to the tracks and said, "Nope, I want them all." And he played on the whole thing. So just imagine you're Dave Grohl for a minute, a guy who's revered not only for playing in Nirvana and starting the Foo Fighters, and not only for being an extraordinarily nice guy, but for sitting in with some of the coolest bands ever. Killing Joke, Tony Iommi, Tenacious D, Nine Inch Nails, and also Ghost. Yes, Tobias Forge has confirmed that Dave did at least one stint as a nameless ghoul. And one wonders whether he was drumming or on guitar or, the multi-ghoul playing the tambourine. I mean, who knows? At this point, Dave Grohl has enough karma in this life to do whatever he wants to do. Anyway, that answers the question of who Killing Joke was. As for Nighttime, at that time, they were Jazz, Geordie, Raven, and Big Paul. So let's dig into the album here. First, let's talk about the cover art. I am not a huge fan of band photos on the cover. To me, it just screams, "We all want to be famous pop stars. Look at our pouting faces and perfectly coiffed hair." Fortunately, this would just be a phase for Killing Joke. Jazz's big old mug is on this album, and the next one, Brighter Than 1,000 Suns. After that, they stopped doing this, thankfully. But here you see Raven, Geordie, Jazz, and Big Paul. So let's look at the booklet. We have some lyrics in here, which is always nice. A little more lyrics. And we have another band shot here. And strangely enough, a page about the merits of the compact disc digital audio system in 4 languages, no less. Fascinating. So let's put that back together. And we'll look at the back here. We have just 8 tracks. Folks, this album is just under 40 minutes long. It's practically an EP by today's standards. And it was produced by Chris Kimsey, who was an old hand by this time, having worked with a lot of, very niche alternative acts like Peter Frampton, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and some guys called the Rolling Stones. Whatever happened to them? I do find the production on this album pretty squared off and clean sounding, much like other albums from the mid-'80s. Definitely no rough edges recording-wise. Overall, the sound of this album is really hard rock with some synth tinges. It's definitely not industrial. There's no sampling here. There's no drum machines. There's no, sounds of factories. This is rock music. You got guitar, bass, drums, some keyboard, and singing. But you can see how this kind of record would influence bands like Ministry in coming years with its attitude, with its aggression, and with the subject matter. So let's talk about the tracks here. We'll just go right down the list and start off with Nighttime. And right away, you get a blast of the Killing Joke sound. You have Raven and Big Paul laying down a pretty relentless rhythm, Geordie coming in with the big repeated hook, and just Jazz surfing on the top. And on this tune, I think Geordie's riff really stands out, the way it interlocks with Paul playing on his electronic Simmons drums. And if you were a drummer in the 80s and you didn't have these big hexagonal things in your kit, you weren't worth a plug nickel, I tell you what. But if you listen really close, you can hear Raven's really funky bass licks. I mean, this guy, I keep saying it, but he was an absurdly good bassist. And you know who his playing reminds me of, and you're going to think I'm crazy, but it reminds me of John Taylor from Duran Duran. You think John Taylor got the gig for his pretty boy looks, but damn, he could lay down some funky bass. I mean, listen to Hungry Like the Wolf very carefully, for instance, or listen to the stuff he did with the Power Station. Raven is in that same territory, but, obviously playing a bit heavier music. Fortunately, we can hear him even better on the second track, Darkness Before Dawn, because Raven's bass drives this tune. It's pretty badass. Geordie takes more of a backseat here. He's providing the atmospherics with Jazz's keyboards. Meanwhile, Big Paul harkens back to Killing Joke's roots with a really tom-heavy tribal beat. And I watched a lot of live videos to reacquaint myself with the band's live performances around this time, and there were a lot of shots of Paul's kit showing how he muted his toms to get that kind of sound, so I'll for sure be stealing some of those ideas from my own kit. Anyway, I like this song. I think it has something like a Joy Division feel to it. I could see Joy Division covering Darkness Before Dawn in some kind of alternate universe where Ian Curtis lived past 1980. Stephen Morris for sure would own this drum pattern, and the guitar here is abstract enough to suit Barney Sumner's playing. Anyway, do you realize that it's almost Ian Curtis Day? That's right, kids. May 18th, for those of us who celebrate. Next up, the big single, Love Like Blood. This is just a straight-up mid-tempo pop tune suitable for getting the band on the radio. Nothing too grating here, a bouncy bass, some nice airy keyboard, some catchy guitar rhythms. This is a vocal line that your mom can sing to. Love Like Blood is a pretty accessible song, something that would not have put off the Van Halen buying public at the time. And I see it did hit number 16 in the UK singles chart, though I don't think it charted at all in the US. There is an official video for this tune, which I remember seeing on MTV back in the day. It's just the band playing the song in a big white room. You know, you got Geordie and Raven wearing some nice turtlenecks. You got Raven playing a headless bass. You know, it just screams 1985. There's some goofy military imagery in there. There's flags. There's guys in uniform. There's girls in uniform. There's a guy holding a sickle. You know, the proletariat. Who knows what it all means? It's some kind of statement against the Cold War, probably. And then we have Kings and Queens here, which they also tapped as a single. What can I say? This is another funky dance tune, not unlike Nighttime. And I say dance tune, but it's like a rock song that you could jump up and down to, really. Kings and Queens is another example of how Big Paul likes to keep time on the floor tom instead of the hi-hat. This song also throws a few extra bars here and there, you know, just to shake things up. Like Paul will throw in an extra long fill. And it's also notable in that Geordie actually plays something that's suspiciously like an actual guitar lead. In fact, he plays it twice. They did a video for this one too, with the band just playing the song on stage in a big smoky club, which is pretty rad. So check it out. And that's side A. Side B starts with Tabazan. The heavy breathing intro gives you some indication of its content. It's not really easy to understand Jazz's lyrics on this one as he's singing them, but, you know, read the lyrics sometime. Good stuff. Some nice riffing by Geordie here as ever. I mean, what can I say? I feel like I'm talking about Curve all over again, because this is another band where, at least on this album, the sound doesn't vary much from song to song. I mean, they would mix up their formula on future albums a bit, which would cause some controversy, but on this album, not so much. But you know what? Who cares when it sounds as good as this, you know? But what's with the title? What does Tabazan mean? And my first guess was that it was a place name, but I don't know, evidently not. In fact, Google pretty much just ties it to this song, so it might be made up. I did find one reference to a person, Francois Tabazan, a Swiss 16th century executioner. But the lyrics don't really point to that being the reference at all. So quite the opposite. So who knows? Who knows? I think he might have just made it up. Track 6 is Multitudes, which, in my opinion, more or less recycles the rhythm section from Love Like Blood. I don't know. Multitudes, this song doesn't really do much for me. It's maybe the black sheep here. I did listen to it again here for this episode and, you know, gave it another chance, kept waiting for something to surprise me. Big Paul lays down some 16th note hi-hats in the chorus, which is pretty unusual for him, I guess. And then at like 3.5 minutes in, it goes into this weird breakdown. It's all discordant and detuned. So that was kind of neat, but it's just really a middle 8 before it locks back into the verse for an instrumental outro. So I don't know what happened there. It was almost like they ran out of ideas and the producer was like, okay, boys, we're all out of gas, so give me 8 bars of detuned noise while Paul keeps a beat. I'm sure it was exactly like that. And let's all go get a pint. Track 7 is Europe. This is another rhythm workout, not unlike War Dance or Nighttime or Kings and Queens. And when I listen to this song, I can almost imagine Geordie trying out riffs, thinking to himself, you know, how little can I get away with? In this case, it's just 2 notes, more or less. 2 notes, and he's just transposing them every couple bars. And that's the song. The chorus does have a bit more, but I gotta say, this song is pretty minimalistic. And we close things out with that perennial classic, 80s. So if it isn't clear by now, this is a really popular song. If you know of just one Killing Joke song, it's probably this one, mainly because it's dragged out into any movie or show or media or whatever it is that has to reference the decade of the 1980s in some way. Like the old That 80s show that came out after That 70s show. I think it was the damn theme song for that, you know, which in retrospect is pretty depressing. But I tell you what, listening to this album again, when this song comes on at the end, I do understand why it was so popular, because it just has a whole other level of energy. It doesn't even belong on the same side as songs like Multitudes and Europe. It is by far the most kick-ass song on here. The whole thing just sounds like it's running at double time. And Geordie's riff, as I mentioned, is just an iconic monster. I mean, no wonder Nirvana swiped it, because it's badass. Now, Jazz's vocals, especially later in his life, have been somewhat compared to Lemmy, which is saying something, since as a vocalist, Lemmy exists in a class of his own. Not just as a vocalist, just period. Lemmy exists in a class of his own. But yeah, I can actually see the resemblance here between Jazz and Lemmy, especially on later albums like Hosannas from the Basements of Hell and Absolute Descent. But here on Nighttime on 80s, that Lemmy-ish quality does kind of peek out from time to time when he's shouting rather than singing and his voice is breaking up, and it really works for this song. But I've seen people online, those people, those knuckle-dragging creeps, moaning about this song, saying stuff like, "Ooh, it's dated." Yeah, of course it's dated. It's called 80s, genius. I mean, what a brilliant observation. It's literally dated. Or, "Ooh, it's all political, complaining about the way things were in the old days." Yeah, well, a funny thing about that, the new days aren't much different than the old days, aren't they? I mean, are you having fun trying to afford that house? You having fun with greedy corporations fleecing you at the store and the pump? Are you having fun with politicians living in some alternate reality? Yeah, I'd say this song's message is still pretty on point. In fact, I still like everything about this song. It's kick-ass. My favorite thing about it, though, is Raven's bass line during the pre-chorus. The bit that goes, "And we say you do it this way." Like, listen very carefully there. The bass is freaking amazing. As George Clinton himself used to say, if you want to capture a boogie, you gotta attack from the back. And that was Paul Raven. He was always attacking from the back. Just what a timeless classic, this song. Even when the band performed it live on recent tours, they still killed it, in my opinion. And of course, the comments are full of kids talking shit about this band. "Ooh, but they're so old. Someone should put them in a retirement home." I mean, first of all, that's baloney, because they still played it at top form. And second of all, if you get your mom to do the math for you, it turns out that bands who had popular hits in the mid-'80s are now hitting retirement age. I mean, it's just a fact. I know it's unbelievable, but it's true. In fact, most of the bands I've talked about in this show are approaching or have hit retirement age. And I'd go so far as to say that most of my listeners are probably at the point in their lives where they're paying an increasing amount of attention to their 401ks. But I am not worried about the comments people make, folks. I'm really not, because I know in the fullness of time, you smart-ass kids making fun of the oldster bands will learn eventually that only the lucky ones get old. And one more thing, get the hell off my lawn. All right, so why do I love this album? I mean, there's all the obvious things. I dig the overall sound. The songs are great for the most part. It has a ton of energy and is a real kick in the ass. The one thing I really liked about it in the old days was that it was a blast to drum along to. And I remember burning CDs of good drumming songs, and a bunch of these songs were on those CDs, and I'd play them on my little Sony Discman that I had plugged into my little drum mixer, and it was really cool. To me, Paul Ferguson on here sounds a lot like Steve Morris in his playing, except as a drummer, I could actually keep up with Paul. I couldn't always keep up with Steve. So yeah, as a guy who is more swayed by rhythm than melody, this album especially hits hard. Raven and Big Paul have something of a mind meld going on here, and I love all of Raven's extra funky touches. Geordie, of course, is no slouch in the rhythm department either. He's primarily playing rhythm after all, whether he's playing repeated riffs or just chugging along. And I dig Big Paul keeping time on the toms. There's something tribal about that just speaks to something deep in the reptile mind, at least my reptile mind. And more so, I love the band in general. I love their approach to music and art. I love their lack of fear. and being controversial or in juxtaposing ideas or just, stirring the pot and never really doing the predictable thing. When you look at their career, it's really remarkable how often they manage to reinvent themselves or just go off in some crazy direction. I mean, I do think that their 21st century albums are some really amazing pieces of work. Deeper, I think, than these early albums from the 80s and 90s, but we'll talk about those some other time. So I do love the band, but I love this album the most since it was my first real experience of them. So what happened next? Well, there were more albums, there were more lineup changes, though always keeping Jazz and Geordie. There were more Armageddons that failed to materialize yet. And as I mentioned, Chris Connolly wrote about meeting Killing Joke in his memoirs and how they were already, in his mind, past their sell-by date in 1990 during the Mind Tour, which is pretty rich since last I checked. Chris and Al are still out there playing the old favorites 34 years after Chris made that judgment. See, he was just another smart-ass kid. But then, some unexpected things would happen in their career. For one, Jazz would find the time to record this album with Ann Dudley of The Art of Noise, Songs from the Victorious City. And this was around 1991 or so. And I will have to talk about this album sometime. Anne, of course, is one of my musical heroes, and this album is pretty much a complete surprise due to its Middle Eastern flavor as much as its pop dance arrangements. And strangely enough, it showcases Jazz Coleman's skills on the violin and the cobra flute. I mean, who knew? This guy's just full of surprises. And really, that isn't the end of it, because he also took time around this era to study classical composition and wound up producing a bunch of symphonic rock albums in the 90s, including Us and Them, symphonic Pink Floyd, which I remember seeing in stores back in the day. I had no idea Jazz was behind that record until recently. And when you look at what he's accomplished, any way you cut it, the guy has had a tremendously successful second career as a classical composer, having collaborated with just a ton of orchestras around the world. In fact, I believe he's still the composer in residence of the Prague Symphony Orchestra, which is pretty nifty. But for one reason or another, Jazz felt the need to bugger off from Killing Joke around 91, leaving the band in the lurch with no singer. No problem. Martin Atkins would swoop in, recruit Chris Connolly, and form a new supergroup called Murder, Inc. Now, the timeline is a bit murky here, but I think this was directly after Pigface's Gub album. Unfortunately, Murder, Inc. would be ill-fated, only releasing one album. Jazz would eventually return and restore Killing Joke to full strength. And they more or less continued through to the present day, having released 15 studio albums in their 44-year history. And one wonders if this is indeed the end. Their Wikipedia article, anyway, still describes them in the present tense. But it's hard to imagine Jazz continuing Killing Joke without Geordie Walker. Well, there you have it, folks. The classic album Nighttime by England's own post-punk pioneers, Killing Joke. I'm glad I finally got them on here because they're an important and influential band, and obviously from everything I just said in the last 5 minutes, you can spin off from them in any one of a dozen directions, to industrial or world music, to classical music, or even to them being covered by Metallica on the 598 EP Garage Days Revisited in 1987, just 2 years after Nighttime came out. So yeah, they had fans all over, to say the least. They may not be the first band you think of, but I guarantee the first bands you do think of have already thought of Killing Joke and have a high opinion of them. You're listening to Stronger Than Reason either on YouTube or as an Apple or Spotify podcast, the show that likes to ramble a bit, go down digressions and rabbit holes and not really get to the point in a hurry. We like to provide some color, not just the facts. If you want the facts, why, you could just read Wikipedia, couldn't you? And what fun would that be? Why, none at all, I say. Dry facts are for chumps and suckers. So stick with us, slow down a bit, And hear some shaggy dog stories from a bitter old man whose own family long ago stopped listening to his old war tales, and whose own cat is now giving him the side eye and claiming to have an important engagement upstairs, under the bed. But as always, thank you for listening, and until next time, stay strong.